They say some objects are haunted because of what they contain. But the Dybbuk Box isn't feared for what's inside. It's feared because no one is entirely sure it was ever meant to hold a spirit at all. The story begins in 2001, when an antique wine cabinet appeared on eBay. The listing was plain, even respectful, written by a man named Kevin Manis, who claimed to have purchased the box at an estate sale in Portland, Oregon. The box had belonged to a Holocaust survivor named Havila, who had fled Nazi-occupied Poland. In her final years, she warned her family never to open it. When Manis bought the box and took it to his furniture shop, strange things began to happen. He described lights flickering, doors locking themselves, shadows moving across walls when no one else was inside. Then came the dreams, repeating visions of an old woman speaking an ancient language he didn't understand. Within weeks, every employee quit, claiming something in the shop was breathing. Manis tried to give the box away, but everyone who received it seemed to suffer. A friend developed a mysterious rash and began coughing blood. His mother, upon touching the box, had a sudden stroke. By the time it was sold again on eBay, the story had spread far beyond collectors. It was called the Dybbuk Box, named after the restless spirit of Jewish folklore said to possess the living. But folklore scholars quickly pointed out something strange. The Hebrew inscriptions etched inside the cabinet warranty consistent with any known ritual for containing a dybbuk. There was no protective prayer, no sealing sigil, just fragments of phrases that translated roughly to memory, binding, and the tears of God. So if the Dybbuk Box wasn't built to imprison a demon, what was it meant to preserve? A trapped soul, or something far older, a memory that refused to fade. As ownership of the box passed from one person to another, its legend deepened, and so did the trail of fear, sickness, and loss that followed it. Because every time someone tried to lock it away, the same thing happened. Something, whatever it was, always found a way to be remembered. Before the Dybbuk Box ever appeared on eBay, the word Dybbuk itself had already haunted centuries of Jewish folklore. It comes from the Hebrew da'aq, to cling, not a ghost in the Western sense, but something far more intimate, the soul of a dead person that latches on to the living. Not to terrify, but to finish what it could not in life. In the old stories of Eastern Europe, the Dybbuk was never born evil. It was a broken fragment, a spirit too wounded or guilty to ascend, searching for warmth inside another's flesh. Rabbis and mystics spoke of it in trembling tones, describing possession not as punishment, but as a cry for help from the forgotten dead. And while exorcisms were performed, they were done with mourning, not hatred, because to cast out a Dybbuk was to free it, not destroy it. When Jewish refugees fled Europe during the Holocaust, they carried not just their few possessions, but these beliefs. Amidst loss too great to speak of, the idea of a trapped spirit, desperate to be remembered, must have felt familiar. And so, some began crafting small boxes, prayer scrolls, or jars containing soil, hair, and fragments of prayer. They weren't designed to imprison evil, but to keep grief from escaping. That's what made Havila's story different. When Kevin Manis traced the box's origin, he learned she had survived a concentration camp. Her family said she performed seances after the war, trying to reach relatives lost in the camps. She reportedly used the small wine cabinet to store the remnants of those rituals. Wax drippings, dried herbs, and a small lock of hair wrapped in string. Over time, the cabinet's purpose was forgotten. It became an heirloom no one dared to open. By the time Manis bought it, all anyone knew was that it was not to be disturbed. But in Jewish mysticism, intent matters more than object. If a container was built to hold sorrow, then every act of grief, every desperate cry near it, feeds what's inside. So when Manis opened the box in his shop, he might not have released a demon. He might have awakened a century of mourning that refused to stay quiet. After Kevin Manis sold the box, he thought he had left its curse behind. But the Dybbuk box seemed to behave like the thing it was named after. It clung. Within days of its sale, Manus began reporting nightmares again. He claimed to see a dark figure standing at the foot of his bed, whispering in Yiddish. He said the dreams didn't stop until he wrote a poem about the box, almost as if the act of remembering it kept the entity calm. The buyer, who followed a student named Iasifnitsky, thought the story was a hoax. He bought it as a conversation piece, a relic of early internet myth-making. But within weeks, his roommates fell ill. Electronics malfunctioned constantly. The air in the apartment grew thick with the smell of jasmine and old metal, and Iasif said every morning he woke up to find his hair damp, as though something had been standing over him, breathing. Then came Jason Haxton, a museum curator and historian who had studied religious artifacts for years. He bought the box to examine it properly, convinced that superstition could be explained through science. But almost immediately, he began to feel unwell, sharp chest pains, bleeding gums, and a strange rash that doctors couldn't diagnose. He recorded his symptoms, the nightmares, even the temperature changes around the box. He documented everything, thinking he was collecting evidence. Instead, he was writing a diary of dissent. Over time, Haxton realized something chilling. Every time he tried to lock the box away, whether in a safe, a storage facility, or even buried underground, he dreamt of a woman pounding from the inside, begging to be remembered. When he brought the box back into his home, the dreams would stop. It was as though the entity didn't want to escape. It wanted witnesses. Experts who examined the cabinet noted that the carvings inside weren't meant to bind a demon, but to mark remembrance. The symbols were closer to early Kabbalistic mourning sigils, visual prayers used to keep a soul's memory from dispersing. But something had twisted that purpose over time. Each new owner treated it as cursed, feared it, sealed it, and in doing so, kept feeding it. When Haxton finally hid the box away, he claimed he encased it in gold-lined wood and buried it deep within a secret location. He refused to say where, only that it was sealed between the living and the dead. But years later, whispers began again. People claimed the box had resurfaced. Collectors, ghost hunters, and filmmakers said they knew where it was, or that they owned it. Some even made replicas. And that's when the pattern began repeating, not just with one object, but many. As if the memory inside the original Dybbuk box had learned to divide itself, attaching to every imitation made in its image. Not a curse spreading through blood or touch, but through belief itself. Long before eBay, long before the word Dybbuk reached Hollywood scripts, there were stories whispered in the candlelit corners of shtetls, small Jewish villages scattered across Eastern Europe. They spoke of spirits that would not pass on, not because they were evil, but because they were unacknowledged. In Yiddish, the term Dybbuk carried weight. It described a soul caught between confession and silence, a ghost fed by unfinished stories. The original tales were tragic, not terrifying. A woman dying in childbirth, whispering a name no one recognized. A man who cheated another before dying and returned inside his victim's body, pleading for forgiveness. In every story, the Dybbuk clung to the living as a plea, not a punishment. And so, rabbis would perform pidyon nefesh, a ritual of release, to free the spirit by acknowledging its pain. It was less an exorcism than a reconciliation. But as centuries passed, the world grew less kind to nuance. When Jewish folklore spread westward, especially after the horrors of the Holocaust, grief became something people wanted to contain, not confront. The Dybbuk transformed from a spirit seeking peace into a demon seeking hosts. The folklore of empathy turned into a mythology of fear. This is why the Dybbuk box fascinates scholars. It doesn't align with tradition. It isn't an ancient vessel or a documented ritual object. The idea of a spirit sealed in a box was never part of Jewish mysticism. That concept came later, a distortion born of desperation, an attempt to trap sorrow physically when prayer could no longer do it. Some historians believe Havilah, the Holocaust survivor whose estate it came from, may have built the cabinet herself, crafting a memorial disguised as a container. The fragments inside, hair, a dried rose petal, coins, could have been symbolic offerings. In that sense, the Dybbuk Box wasn't a prison at all. It was a mourning ritual turned object, an altar to remember those who never returned. But there's something deeply human and dangerous about our instinct to lock grief away. When pain is sealed instead of spoken, it rots. And over generations, that decay can take on a form. Maybe not a demon in the traditional sense, but an echo. A resonance of memory that grows heavier each time it's feared, spoken of, or replicated. So when modern collectors handled the Dybbuk Box, they weren't awakening a spirit Havilah trapped. They were awakening what she tried to protect herself from losing. Her grief, her love, her refusal to forget the faces that history erased. And that's what made it so powerful. The box didn't contain evil. It contained memory. And memory, when shared by too many people at once, becomes its own kind of haunting. By 2012, the Dybbuk Box had become more than a cursed relic. It was a cultural obsession. Jason Haxton's book, The Dybbuk Box, had reached bookstores and talk shows, turning what began as an antique store mystery into a phenomenon that blurred the line between folklore and modern myth. Hollywood came calling almost immediately. The film The Possession, produced by Sam Raimi, claimed to be based on a true story. It dramatized the box as a gateway to demonic possession, a clear departure from the historical Dybbuk's origins. Yet, during production, eerie events were reported. Lights would flicker on set. Props moved when no one touched them. And when filming wrapped, a mysterious fire destroyed the storage warehouse containing all the movie's set pieces, including the replica box. The official report cited electrical failure, but crew members swore the power had been off. That was when something changed. The legend stopped belonging to one object and began belonging to everyone who believed in it. Copycat Dybbuk boxes flooded the internet. Collectors, thrill-seekers, and paranormal YouTubers bought them, opened them live on camera, and claimed to hear whispers or feel cold hands touch their backs. Some reported nightmares and sleep paralysis. Others claimed nothing happened until they watched another video of someone else opening a box. Scholars noticed something uncanny in this pattern. The haunting seemed to travel not through touch, but through attention. Each retelling of the story, each viral post, each whispered theory became part of the same invisible ritual. In Jewish mysticism, there's an old belief that words have power, that speaking something gives it form. So what happens when millions speak of the same ghost at once? The Dybbuk Box became a perfect modern curse, a legend that feeds not on faith, but on curiosity. Every person who researches it, talks about it, or fears it, unknowingly strengthens the idea that something inside it must be real. Because deep down, we understand how dangerous memory can be, and how sacred. When Haxton finally appeared in interviews years later, he seemed quieter, less certain than before. He admitted that the box's power might not come from the supernatural at all, but from the stories told about it. The Dybbuk Box, he said softly, is a mirror. It reflects whatever people bring to it: fear, guilt, loss. And once it reflects you back, you can't look away. That explanation should have ended the legend, but instead, it gave it new life. Because what's more terrifying than a curse you can't destroy? A curse that only exists because you believe in it. After Jason Haxton sealed the Dybbuk Box, he claimed it was placed in a secret location, somewhere between the world of the living and the world of the dead. For years, the story went quiet. But silence doesn't last long when the internet is listening. In 2018, the box resurfaced in the hands of Las Vegas museum owner Zach Bagans. Known for his collection of haunted artifacts, he displayed it behind reinforced glass, claiming that it had been blessed, sealed, and guarded by multiple faith leaders before it could be exhibited. Visitors described a pressure in their chest as they approached it. Cameras malfunctioned. Some fainted without explanation. Even celebrities who visited the museum, like rapper Post Malone, reported strange accidents afterward: a near-plane crash, a car wreck, and a home invasion, all within weeks of touching the box's display case. But skeptics pointed out that by this point, it almost didn't matter whether the artifact was authentic. The Dybbuk Box had become a vessel for collective imagination. Every whispered retelling, every cautious mention online, kept feeding the same intangible force. Even attempts to disprove it only widened its reach. Because the Dybbuk Box didn't need to be real to cause real fear, it only needed to be believed in. Religious historians studying the case began to see it less as a haunting and more as a modern manifestation of an ancient human reflex. Across cultures, we've always tried to trap the things that hurt us, our grief, guilt, and longing, inside something physical. In ancient Greece, they sealed hope inside Pandora's jar. In the Middle Ages, they buried witch bottles under doorsteps to imprison curses. And in modern America, we call it a Dybbuk Box. But the most chilling interpretation comes from Kabbalistic scholars who revisited the Hebrew phrases etched into its wood. One rabbi noted that the markings weren't written as warnings. They were incomplete blessings, half-finished prayers. It was as if the person who made the box began writing a memorial for the dead, but never finished it. That unfinished intention, love interrupted, grief unsaid, might have been what gave the object its strange persistence. So when people speak of the Dybbuk Box as cursed, perhaps they're not wrong, but the curse might not be supernatural. It might be the inheritance of sorrow, the proof that pain doesn't die when people do. It finds new containers. Sometimes, those containers are made of wood. Sometimes, they're made of words. And if the stories are true, the Dybbuk Box is still out there, waiting, not for another owner, but for someone willing to remember what it was really built to hold. There's a reason no one agrees on where the Dybbuk Box is today. Some say it remains sealed beneath layers of protection in a museum vault. Others whisper it was moved again, hidden somewhere in Europe to rest near the soil it remembers. But the truth may be simpler and much harder to face. The Dybbuk Box was never just an object. It was a story. And stories, once told, don't stay still. They change shape, pass through mouths, travel through circuits and screens until they no longer belong to anyone. That's what happened here. The spirit didn't escape from wood and hinges. It escaped through language. Every retelling opens it a little more. Every skeptic, believer, documentarian, and storyteller becomes a temporary keeper of the box. And maybe that's why no one has ever been able to end the legend. Because what the original owner sealed wasn't a demon or a ghost, it was remembrance itself. Every time someone tells the story again, the memory breathes. In Jewish mysticism, they say that to remember the dead is to give them life. Forget them, and they vanish. Remember them, and they walk beside you. If that's true, then the Dybbuk Box isn't haunted by one soul, it's haunted by thousands. All the griefs and silences and interrupted prayers it has absorbed now echo in the way we speak its name. Perhaps that's what the final inscription meant, the tears of God, a poetic reminder that sorrow, once shed, never really dries. It soaks into whatever can hold it, the earth, a wooden cabinet, or a frightened voice whispering into a microphone late at night. So when you hear the story again, whether in a museum, on a forum, or through a voice like mine, remember that the curse has already found you, not through possession or touch, but through the oldest magic humans know, the act of listening. And when the lights flicker, when you feel that brief chill in the air, don't be afraid. It doesn't mean the Dybbuk is near. It only means the memory heard its name and looked back